Hello, today I will talk to you about narcissism. In particular, I will give you 5 fairly precise indicators that, if you find that you possess them in some way in your character or way of being, could trigger a warning regarding narcissism. However, before we delve into these 5 aspects, it is important to make some preliminary remarks together and talk a little about narcissism. You see, I have already done this in several contributions that I definitely invite you to check out on the YouTube channel or on the website ricogambo.org. But here, I feel I should tell you that a component of narcissism is something that, to some extent, we all tend to have. We all tend to have, or have had, what is called narcissistic injury, which somehow then gives rise to a disorder. That is narcissism. Where disorder is an indicator, it is like saying a category that is assigned when the peculiarity of a person's mind is such that it limits them in at least 3 fundamental functions of life, which are affections, self-care, and work, as well as social life and activity. To talk about narcissistic personality disorder, we should discuss a structure so peculiar that it leads to limitations in these 3 areas of life, and I have already mentioned this while discussing narcissistic personality disorder. However, I would like to give you some indications that may certainly be true when you actually have a narcissistic personality disorder, but that you might somehow see in your life, recognizing them in yourself, even if you do not have a pronounced and structured narcissistic personality disorder, because they are characteristics that some of us tend to have a little bit as well. I make this premise because, regarding narcissism, a strong negative media push has also been created, where the narcissist is seen in some way as a demonic, evil being who is only trying to suck the blood from their victims. In reality, here is the narcissistic trait, a trait that is already different from a disorder. A narcissistic personality trait is a component that, unfortunately, can manifest in a person's inner life and can also be very limiting for the individual, although, as we will see, it can lead them to engage in actions and behaviors that can clearly be very harmful to others, to the people close to them. There is also a distinction made in the various diagnostic classifications that have been developed over the years between different types of narcissism. I have also discussed this, overt narcissist versus covert, for example. Here, there are different types, but let's say that there are some common characteristics that it is useful to examine together. If you find that you have some of these traits, they could give you indications of a tendency towards narcissism, which is worth working on a little. Why? Because it requires work. Clearly, when we talk about the structures of the mind, as I mentioned, there are different levels. Let's call it that. Of course, if I realize that I have a certain tendency, I can essentially work on it. Then it depends on how much it has been structured within me over the course of my life. So, what are these 5 signs that I invite you to consider in order to try to understand if you have a tendency towards narcissism, or if you even find yourself having a more structured disorder? For which, clearly, I refer you to colleagues, specifically psychotherapists, who can somehow assist you with a diagnosis. Clearly, this contribution that I am making now is not a contribution that claims in any way to provide you with a diagnostic classification. These 5 aspects that I will mention are not exhaustive for making a diagnosis of narcissism, but as I mentioned, they are interesting indicators to consider. So, the first indicator is a sense of grandiosity. If you have the inner feeling of having this sense of grandiosity, this sense of superiority over others, this is a first indicator that should make you pay attention. This feeling of being worth more than others, of being better than others, of deserving more than others, and this sense of having grandiosity. Because you see, I have known extremely grandiose people, that is, people who, when you meet them, you say, look at this one. He is truly a genius, an enlightened person, who was perhaps humble, who was maybe a moderate person, a calm person. Why not? Here, the sense of grandiosity, which is somewhat typical of narcissism and has been less justified, is precisely this great focus on oneself, as if you were the most relevant person. Recent research, specifically in recent years on narcissism, has shown a correlation, for example, between a parenting style, where parents tend to be very indulgent and nurturing, and the subsequent development of a narcissistic form in children and later in adults. It appears that being constantly praised by parents, being placed on a pedestal, and being somewhat spoiled by them seems to be one of the components that can lead to the development of a narcissistic structure. So, what is the idea? It is that this sense of being better than others, which can arise from different structures and situations like the one I just mentioned, is a classic example of narcissism. In narcissism, a classic view is that the person who is actually more fragile deep down needs to cling desperately to this grandiose self, as if it were a desperate attempt to hold together the pieces of themselves. Here, this is another interpretation given to this grandiose self, but beyond the cause, beyond the origin a bit, if you find yourself having this perception of being worth more than others, of being better than others, perhaps you should take a moment to stop and reflect. The second signal is a constant need for admiration and approval. If you realize that, and look, this is something you can only evaluate with yourself, that's why it's also a very intimate matter. But if you find yourself often in different situations in life, feeling the need to have the approval of others, the approval of your parents, the approval of friends, the approval of your partner, the approval of society, the approval of everyone else, and feeling like you want to be a little bit at the center of their attention, here is another aspect that should make you reflect for a moment. No. I wouldn't want to be misunderstood. As I mentioned at the beginning, we all have a bit of narcissism. It feels good for all of us to feel seen and appreciated. For example, I am creating a video on YouTube, and if this video gets millions of views, it will undoubtedly make me happy because it will tell me, well, look, you did something useful, something beautiful, something that many people appreciated, right? It is acceptable and a healthy component of narcissism. The problem arises when narcissism, when this need for admiration and approval becomes so important that it fills our mental space to the point where I may not even be able to recognize my own needs because my main focus is on feeling appreciated or admired by others, for example. Here we already enter an area that you will understand is more of a boundary between health and illness, between well-being and pathology. So here it is. If you find this second element, which is a constant strong need for admiration and approval from others, this is also an element that could lead you to reflect more on yourself. The third element is a lack of empathy. You know, the empathy supported by our mirror neurons is a fundamental component for the survival of the species, but also for our psychological well-being, for our relational well-being, and it is essentially the ability to truly feel the other, to suffer with the other, empathy, to live what the other is experiencing, even simply by looking at them with a gaze thus being moved if I see the other suffering, or rejoicing if I see the other rejoicing. In narcissism, even the more pathological forms, there is undoubtedly a lack of empathy. As a more subtle trait, things may happen around me, and I feel somewhat insensitive, as if they are not important or relevant to me. Even if bad or heavy things occur, they do not affect me at all. Alternatively, when requests for help are made, I feel a bit distant, a bit cold, as if it is not important to me. This is also an element, it's an aspect that I could take into consideration, because as I mentioned, we can all have a bit of narcissism, and sometimes it can even become limiting for ourselves, you see, because it can somehow restrict us, it can block us a little in life. It can prevent us, for example, from empathizing, which is a beautiful experience because empathizing with others means being able to feel for them. But the narcissist needs to protect themselves from this as well. Why? Because experiencing what the other feels means shifting the focus from oneself to the other. And as I mentioned before, being focused on oneself is a way to manage that sense of fragmentation that the narcissist experiences, precisely because they do not actually have a solid self, as they may portray with this grandiose self. Therefore, empathy is actually something that takes the narcissist out of themselves, which they cannot afford to do so easily. The fourth, interesting and important, classic point about narcissism, which I clearly invite you to evaluate and consider, is the tendency to somewhat exploit others. So, from this perspective, our society is a bit narcissistic. I talked, for example, about malice, the D factor, the dark factor of personality, defined as the tendency to look out for oneself, essentially, even with the awareness of going against the interests of others, while telling oneself a series of stories to justify one's actions. This is considered somewhat the dark factor of personality, of which narcissism is certainly a component. Here I am talking about the simple tendency to exploit others, meaning if you realize that you do things without considering the needs of others, but remaining a bit too focused, or more focused anyway, on your own needs. Therefore, you need to conduct an as objective analysis as possible, which you should do only with yourself, so you don't need to deceive yourself. You realize that in fact the things you do not take into account the needs of others much, but only center around your own, sometimes even with a conscious intent to exploit the resources, energies, and availability of others. This is also an indicator that should raise a little alarm for you. Another element, the fifth one I'm giving you today, and there would be others that should be explored further, so maybe write to me in the comments so we can discuss it, and perhaps we can introduce other contributions on this topic, is envy. Because you see, envy is a strong emotion that lives deep within the narcissist. Envy mixed with a sense of resentment towards others, because as I was saying, narcissism arises from a wound, from a narcissistic injury that comes from not feeling fully recognized, from not feeling fully loved, from not feeling truly seen, from not being able to experience that real sense of connection with the other. So much so that the narcissist, at first the classic narcissist, tends to have this need for a deep fusion with the other, for great closeness, for great intimacy, almost in search of that profound connection that they have never truly experienced, that deep emotional closeness, which, however, typically reveals itself in a drama, because there is this great separation, this significant distancing from the other, when the narcissist realizes that the other is not that idealized object, identical to themselves, that they had somehow glimpsed at the beginning. Then there are various distinctions. The narcissist is somewhat malevolent, someone who does it consciously. In short, this opens up a broad field that is not the focus here to explore further. But here's the thing. If you realize that you have a tendency to feel a bit of envy towards others, to feel some resentment, this sense of injustice towards life, this is also a rather interesting indicator to consider that might make you reflect on what is perhaps not a pathology or a disorder, for which I clearly invite you to conduct more in-depth analyses. Rather, it may be a tendency, a trait, specifically an unresolved narcissistic injury, that can somehow lead you to have this shift towards yourself, which, as I mentioned, can have a whole series of complications in your life. Because simply put, if you have pronounced narcissistic traits that limit you in relationships, for example, it will be difficult for you to truly experience a meaningful relationship over time, to genuinely feel a sense of closeness and intimacy with the other person, to really feel part of life with them, to feel truly connected. Because, simply put, if I have this vision of myself that remains a bit on this pedestal, that remains different from others, that remains detached, deserving of more, then perhaps I won't be able to have what I want. And I end up in that whole loop of frustration. Typically, this does not help and does not make life better. These are just 5 indicators. As I mentioned, there are surely others. It might be worth doing some further research. If you're interested, feel free to let me know in the comments, and I'll think about it and work on it. For the rest, I invite you, as I mentioned, to check out the other content I have already created on this topic. If you want, you can also explore the site. In the topic search, if you type in Narcissism, several posts will come up, and then also some videos on my site, raikogambo.org. See you soon.